So thanks so much for joining us. My name is Liz Damcheski, and I'm the relationship manager here at Gerber. Gerber works with first-generation entrepreneurs, and we help them integrate their business, life, and personal goals. So what that really means is we work with business owners to create a roadmap that not only helps them grow a sustainable business, but also allows them to build their personal wealth and meet their goals along the way. So before we start, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. So just so you guys know, everyone is on mute. And please be sure to put any questions in the chat box feature or the Q&A feature, and they will be answered at the very end of the presentation. So moving forward, it's my pleasure to introduce Rob Schuler and Craig Grant of Worthington Energy Consultants. Wanted to go over just a little bit of background for both of the individuals, and then I will pass it over to Rob to move forward with the presentation. So Craig Grant is the owner of Worthington Energy Consultants. They are an industry leader in ESG implementation and advanced energy procurement strategies that help small business owners and Fortune 500 companies reduce their energy spend and carbon footprint across the country. So Craig has over 10 years of experience in the energy space and has worked with clients such as Abercrombie, Heartland Bank, and John Glenn International, just to name a few of the local companies. Rob Schuler is a founding member of Worthington Energy Consultants, and he has over 15 years of experience working with his clients to maximize their utility spend with various energy suppliers and regulated utilities. So I'm going to pass it over to Rob to go through the presentation, and I'm going to go ahead and mute myself moving forward.
Thank you, Liz. Appreciate that. Thanks everybody for being on. I don't think we need any more introduction of Worthington or Craig or me. Our firm has traditionally been a procurement-centric firm. However, in the last 3 or 4 years, we have been observing that the environmental initiatives of a number of our clients have gotten a lot more attention. And so we began about 4.5 years ago now to really start focusing on renewable options for our clients. Traditionally, they've been fairly limited and they've been very expensive, and so they weren't typically well adopted. But the environmental community, about 6 years ago, realized that they had to change the focus of their efforts from initiating programs that were regulatory, things like the CAFE standards with cars and some of the pollution control regulations and things you saw with the EPA, to focusing on how do they get a greater adoption on the corporate level. So rather than regulation and then internally trying to have the sustainability folks that were on staff promote the interest, they started going to the finance community. And so the first wave that we saw was the reinsurers out of Europe, the Swiss Re, the Alliance. The Europeans they're much further along the renewable, sustainable path than the United States. They started looking at the climate change liability for their clients, and they started rating them, which meant the insurance companies began to do that too. And they started to look down the road, and they looked at things like New York versus Chevron, where the city of New York was suing Chevron for their part in climate change liability because of all of the purported current and future damages that the state of New York was going to suffer from climate change. That case has gotten thrown out pretty much, but the insurance company said, look, at some point this is going to come to fruition, and we need to start to mitigate that, and our clients need to start to mitigate that. Then the rest of the financial community became more engaged, particularly Jamie Dimon over at Chase. The rating houses, S&P, Fitch, Moody's, all began to start having questionnaires and or rating their clients based upon the potential long-term climate change liability. And then we started to see the larger PE firms, the Blackrocks, the Vanguards, start to get more active. Blackrock and Leon Blackrock are clearly the most active. And his 5,223 companies received a letter in which they invest saying, we need you to start looking at these things. And then we just saw recently with Exxon and Chevron that there was some They joined in with some shareholders to try to change the board in the case of Exxon and try to change some of the corporate policies in the case of Chevron. So because of that, some of the very large companies, and then add to that the FANG group, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Netflix, the Googles, the large data users, they've been very focused on renewable energy for some time. So because of that, it's no longer the sustainability person that's trying to promote this. It's now the CFO is telling the sustainability person, we need to have solutions. Then under near the end of the Obama administration, they joined the Paris Accords. The Trump administration, while pulling out of those, any of the multinationals that operate in Europe in particular, but in many of the other countries worldwide.
Rob, sorry to interrupt, but we just got notification. Can you just speak a little bit louder, because it's a little bit difficult to hear you? Sorry.
I'm sorry. I can definitely talk louder.
Okay, great.
So on Paris, even though the companies, even though the United States have pulled out, if you're a multinational, you still need to adhere to the standards that were set up in Europe and the other countries that were signatories to the accord. Now, of course, with the Biden administration, they're seeking to rejoin that. And so there became a much more significant emphasis. A part of that emphasis then flowed down to the suppliers of these large corporations. And that's where, in particular, our clients were heavily engaged. And so we started getting more and more inquiries on what can we do on a sustainable basis. Traditionally, there have been some limits as to what you can do. And I think we may have some slides on this, if Annie, if you might be able to throw those up. That's us. I think we can move past that. And so here are some headlines. Kind of some of the things that we were mentioning. The board seats, if you look through those, we won't go through each of those, but just across the board, and this is probably in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And as you get to the $1 trillion question in the headline, there are 3 major banks that have stated their goal is to dedicate a significant portion of their efforts in the trillions with a T to environmental and green initiatives. Now, some of this is just recategorizing and repackaging things they were going to do anyway, but some of it is new initiatives. And so I think you've got JP Morgan, Bank of America, and Citibank all at $1 trillion plus, saying that this is the way they're going to redirect their funding and their investment and their charitable donations. On the converse side, you're seeing companies such as coal companies and natural gas companies and steel companies having a very difficult time now lining up financing from some of the traditional firms because the ESG initiatives have been so significant. And then they, in turn, where they get their money from the pension funds, they're also saying, hey, gee, we're going to hold you, the banks and the PE firms, accountable. The CalPERS and the CalSTRS and some of the, particularly the more blue states, are being very aggressive in requiring a financial incentive of an ESG requirement on the firms into which they invest. So we started getting more and more inquiries from our clients, and traditionally, there are some ways that you could get renewable and sustainable energy. Andy, could we go to the next slide, please? And the renewable and sustainable energy falls under the scope 2 emissions. And so there are what's called ESG scores, environmental, societal, and governance. We focus traditionally on the environmental. Societal are things like diversity, not using slave labor to make your products, things along those lines. Governance is transparency, how you operate, and all internal governance, some of which are publicly traded, some of which aren't. But on the environmental side, there's an effort to look at your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are those things that happen in your companies. So if you make plastics, what kind of emissions are you creating that might affect your greenhouse gas emissions? Scope 3 are the emissions that you can't control. So that would be creating so if your employee is flying on an airplane, there's a certain carbon footprint attached to that. And the ESG efforts on scope 3 would like to have that recorded and categorized and then offset. On scope 2 emissions, that's largely electricity and natural gas, sometimes steam, sometimes propane, the things that a company uses to keep its operations going. And that could be, a large manufacturer, a steel smelter, that kind of thing. Or it could be, we work with one of the, I think it is the largest payment processing company in the world now, to help reduce all of their electricity and natural gas, or to make their electricity and natural gas renewable and sustainable on a enterprise-wide basis. And literally they're around the world, so it represents a number of different challenges, so that they can report that they have 100% drop in their scope 2 emissions. There are some other ways to reduce your scope 2 emissions too, which are energy efficiency and demand response. There's a whole host of things we have in our cabinet that we can work with on a bespoke basis for each of our clients. But the primary way to do this is you can reduce the amount of electricity you're using, but for the remaining electricity you're using, we would look to have a renewable and sustainable sourcing for that. Traditionally, you could do one of a couple of things. You could put solar in, put things behind the meter on your site that go directly into your meter, so that for whatever you're using, you could go out and purchase solar or wind from a developer. And then typically the way those arrangements work is that you would go out and you would agree to buy a finite amount of, say, 100 million kilowatt hours of solar. The challenges with that is that you're relying upon the developer being able to, so what typically the developers of solar and wind projects do is they go out and they get a bunch of commitments from companies, and then they go out and try to borrow the money necessary to meet those commitments and build the plant and build the facilities, the solar field or the wind farm. And in doing that, sometimes they aren't able to meet their commitments, aren't able to meet their timelines, and you're subject to that deficiency. The other challenge is that if you're buying 100 million kilowatts of solar power from a solar developer, you have to buy that whether you need it or not. And if you buy too much, you need more than that, you have to go out on the market and find it. If you don't need that much, then the solar developer, you have to go off, and you're in the energy business now. You're selling off that solar. It may be at a profit, it may be at a loss. The third challenge is because it's a take or pay contract and because it's a long-term agreement, it's typically considered an on-balance sheet transaction. So effectively, you are lending your credit to another. Because of that, unless you're a very large player, PPPs or PPAs were not as well received. So we came up with a new product that we worked with one of our large suppliers, a division of American Electric Power, AEP Energy. It's called the Integrated Renewable Energy Program. So instead of you as the client going out and making these purchases, you as a client would contract with AEP Energy, and AEP Energy would agree over a long term to provide you your renewable energy, whether it be wind or solar, at 100% basis over an extended period at a fixed kilowatt hour rate. So it's very similar to the contracts most of you are probably using right now, where you only pay for what you use. You pay your utility, which then pays the supplier, but you're able to claim 100% renewable energy, and you're able to meet any of the ESG requirements under scope 2 that your clients and your customers may be requiring. Most of what we just talked about are the really big players. The really big players, though, are moving down the supply chain now, and they're requiring their vendors and their suppliers to meet the same standards they're meeting. So, for instance, we represent some large agricultural interests that sell to companies like Walmart and others that are saying you need to be able to start providing your ESG scores. We have a large packaging company. They've got a number of, I think, a dozen different facilities where they package and co-pack and ship. We got a call from them saying we need to have a renewable solution in 30 days because one of our large customers is requiring it. We represent a large truck manufacturer, and the CFO told the facilities folks, in 30 days I need to have a renewable solution because I have to report on this. So that's where we're engaged, and that's where medium and smaller sized businesses are now finding that they have this requirement as well. The challenge that they have that's unique to the medium and small businesses is that the system for acquiring renewable energy is designed on a cost and scale basis for very large customers. So smaller customers are limited to buying what's called a renewable energy credit, which is effectively an offset. Recently, however, and that's what most folks have done, and it's similar to if you rent a car and they say, do you want to pay an extra $1.75 a day to offset your carbon footprint for this car? It's very similar to that. You're basically paying for an offset. The challenge is many of those offsets have the suspect lineage, and as a result, they are falling out of favor. And they're also, they've been relatively expensive, but they've gone from last year, about this time, we could get them for about 80 cents a megawatt hour. And just recently, Craig priced them out at, I think, $3.80 a megawatt hour. And that's largely as a result of the Biden administration's initiatives to push a renewable, sustainable solution. Everybody's jumping on the bandwagon. And so when you've got a limited supply and an indefinite demand, the costs are going up. That's all the past. Going forward, we think that there's going to be some significant disruption in the market. The federal government has stated that they're looking at a whole of government approach to try to promote the environmental agenda that then candidate Biden, now President Biden, ran on. These are folks that mostly worked in the Obama administration. They're familiar with government. They've been very aggressive. We've already seen the SEC and the Commodities Commission say that they're going to start requiring ESG reporting for publicly traded companies and large commodity traders. The Treasury Department has a task force of all the financial regulatory entities in the federal government to try to promote responsibility in climate change. There are efforts in each of the agencies, each cabinet secretary, and each of the independent agencies has appointed someone that is focusing on how they can use the implements of government to drive change on the environmental basis. And then they're doing some things internally that are specific to the government. So the General Services Administration, which either they or the Defense Department are the largest purchaser of energy in the country. The other one's number two. Have announced that by 2025, I think it's 186 million square feet of federal property is going to be powered by renewable energy. The administration is seeking to have 500,000 new EV charging stations in place in 5 years. 100,000 of those will be DC chargers. If they're successful, those DC chargers use about 500,000 kilowatt hours each of electricity a year on average. So you can start to see the scale of the additional electricity uses, and they're going to demand that those be powered by renewable energy. So we think there's going to be some disruptions in the market. If you are going to be in the market for renewable energy, we think now is the time. It's more expensive than it was a year ago, but we think it's going to get horrifically expensive, with the potential of that at least, in 24, 25, and 26. 25 is the year in which most of the folks have announced goals for meeting these standards, and we think there's going to be a big run on that. Can we go to the next slide, Annie? It's possible. We can pass through that one. That's okay. And I guess we'll leave that one because it's near the end. So one of the questions I imagine some folks are thinking is, okay, this is for all the big boys, the large multinationals. How do we figure out a solution? What is it that we need to do to meet these standards? Well, one, you can call Craig at Worthington. We've got a team of folks that can be of assistance. There are some other open source opportunities to look at different standards. Walmart has, if you go to their website, get to the sustainability areas, if you go into their vendor section, they have a lot of resources. They have opened that up to non-vendors because they're trying to help develop a marketplace here. Microsoft has announced that they're going to be providing an open source solution. I don't know if that's occurred yet. I think it's in the next couple of weeks that'll be launched. And the value of that is in part telling you what the standards are now, but there is an international effort to drive what they call core carbon principles. There's still not agreement on what a carbon marketplace would look like if you're buying offsets that have a provenance that are of high quality. And the accountants are trying to develop what's the equivalent of a sustainable standard, equivalent to GAP standards that can be used because there is still a whole lot of uncertainty. So the approach that we're using with our clients is, let's go with something, because these are typically longer term commitments, that is unassailable, that will be available for the future, and that you will not have to remake the puzzle later. I know I've talked a lot, throughout a lot of words and a lot of concepts, but if anybody has any questions, Craig or I are both available to answer those.
Yeah, Rob, so I had a question. So is there a business that's too small to even consider thinking about this? Because like you said, right now it is more of the big players, and you foresee this trickling down to smaller business owners. But I mean, what's your prediction on when? And to my earlier point of, how small of a business do you think that this is going to affect?
Ultimately, it's going to become a universal standard. It's going to be like EEOC or Consumer Product Safety Commission kinds of standards. They're just going to be a part of life. But not every business has, while they may fall under some requirement there, they aren't an acute requirement that's something in front of their minds every day. Their operations are such that they don't need to follow those. I mean, if you look back, pre 1929, publicly traded companies weren't even required to provide financials, even though they were on the stock market. So we're going to see a lot more of things like that. What we do when we get together with the client is we look operationally at where this affects them. So if you aren't going to be going to the public markets or even the banks and other lenders for funds, if you aren't selling to a company, then this may not impact you. If you think it is going to impact you, or you just like the concept, there is nothing too small. And in fact, we've got some very small companies where we're working with them to try to come up with a renewable solution. And a lot of this is forward facing too. I mean, when we did Abercrombie and Fitch, they were looking at all these other things, but they recognize that they have a younger, more environmentally conscious consumer base, and they wanted to have a forward-facing green strategy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So some of it goes back to the operations. I mean, it's whatever you think you need is what we try to get from it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So what can business owners do now? I mean, you mentioned contacting Craig and just having a conversation about whether this is a road that they should be going down, really, right?
Absolutely, and getting ahead of the curve and finding out if you need to get ahead of the curve. You may not even be on the curve, but Craig's not going to. There's no obligation to call and say, "Hey, here's where I am. Here's what I'm doing. Here are my goals. am I good with where I am now, or is there some solution I should start to explore?
Right. And so this is a fluid situation, right? So there's the new administration and they're pushing this through, right, to the bigger companies. So do you foresee that changing if there's an administration change like down the road?
Well,
Or
so
do you
if you
think it's
listen,
only going to get tighter?
if you listen to the podcast and the webinars, the folks on there that are part of there, I mean, there's a large group of people that are kind of the organizers and the implementers. And most of them worked in the Obama administration. And they say openly, we thought we were going to have 4 more years under Hillary to lock this in. We didn't. We've now learned from what could happen. And moving forward, we're looking this to make a whole of government and permanent. So no matter who the president is, it can't be changed. Worldwide, it's continuing to happen. And so when you have, the days of, the 1950s where you had everybody thought that the leaders of the financial world were a bunch of stodgy old, Republican men. That's no longer the case. I mean, the leaders of the environmental initiatives are the finance community. And so, candidly, they run the world. So we have to kind of follow along and see how they, and follow along with their lead. So we do think this is a permanent function. Now, over time, most utilities and the goals of the federal government are to have most of the energy generation in the United States by 2035 to be renewable. And if you look at the announcements from the utilities, most of them are going to be pretty far along in 2035. Some have hedged 2050. So presumably in 13 years or so, or 14 years or so, this is not going to be an issue, because when you turn on your light, it's all going to come from some kind of renewable power.
So we do have a question. The question is, how is Ohio supporting these efforts?
Ohio's in a unique position. House Bill 6, which passed a year or two ago, was an effort to subsidize the nuclear power plants owned by First Energy. As a part of that process, they removed what is called the renewable standards that we had in the state, which required each utility to have a renewable portfolio standard for a percentage of their electricity load. They took that away. They said, gee, we'll save a lot of money. We're going to support these nuclear plants, which are not carbon emitting, but not renewable. And we're going to take away the renewable portfolio standards to help ease the burden on the electric consumer. Since then, they've repealed the subsidies for the nuclear plants, but they did not reinitiate the renewable portfolio standards. Interestingly, though, the business community is seeking to have something brought back into place, and it's because many, particularly in the IT world, are having challenges hiring people from the coast because they view Ohio as a dirty state because of this. I met with somebody from Kroger, and they said, "Look, we're not a grocery company as much as we are an IT company these days, and I'm having a hard time getting IT people to come into Ohio because they think it's a dirty state." And so that aspect of the typical chamber of commerce, I'm not speaking on behalf of the chamber, but the typical chamber of commerce crowd are saying we need to do something so that when we're hiring, we can attract people here from the coast.
Makes sense. Awesome. Is there any more questions? You guys want to put them in the chat? Doesn't look like we have any more. Thank you for your time. I feel like this was very insightful. And just so everybody knows, it is recorded, so we will be emailing it out. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or connect with Craig or Rob. And thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Rob, for your time. I appreciate it.
And by the way, if any of your clients have any solutions in the environmental world, we're always looking forward to seeing those. So
awesome.
Give Craig a call and pitch him.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.